They ripped my dress in front of 200 people and 3 million watched live. The hand that slapped me was polished, decisive, and meant to erase me. The fabric that gave way at my hip fell faster than I could think. Phones rose like lances. A laugh swelled from some corner of the room and then split into a chorus. Someone shouted, "Trash." Someone else streamed it to the world. For a moment, everything was reduced to the sound of fabric tearing and my own breath, short and sharp. Then the cameras multiplied, and the room swallowed itself in a roar. I remember the sting, of course, but what I remember most clearly is the silence that followed the slap. Not just the stunned hush, but the silence from the one person I thought would stand with me. Brandon stood there, hands at his sides, eyes blank. He didn't move toward me. He didn't take my hand. He didn't pull me out of the way of those hands. He just watched as if he were seeing a play he didn't know how to stop. Listen, I am not telling you this because I want pity. I am telling you because people need to understand what it's like to test love in a world that uses public shaming as currency. People need to know how quickly respect can dissolve when status is on the line, and how power can change the story in a single moment. I grew up with money, yes. My name is Emma. My father is William Harrison. He built and led a tech company that made him extremely wealthy. But money wasn't my identity. From the time I could choose, I chose not to live inside the world that followed my last name. I wanted relationships that began with who I was, not what I owned. So I rented the smallest apartment I could find, took the longest subway in the morning to my graphic design job, and learned how to make a small space feel like home. I cooked dinners for one. I carried a chipped mug. I knew the exact route the delivery bike took to avoid the expensive boutiques. When I met Brandon, he worked in real estate. He had a quiet laugh and a real way of listening. He liked the messy ink stains I always found on my hands after a creative binge. He didn't ask about my father. He told me embarrassing stories about his childhood. He left 3-day-old pizza on my counter and didn't apologize because he had convinced himself we were building something messy and real. After 3 months of dating, he asked me to come to his mother's annual business dinner. He said it was important to him. He said, "You should meet my family." Those words felt like acceptance. But I had been careful. I'd learned the hard way that people are more sincere when you are a blank page to them. So when Brandon extended that invitation, I made a choice. Not cruelly, not deceitfully. I wanted to see whether he loved me or the idea of me, whether he loved the person who washed the dishes and debated Pantone shades with a stubborn intensity, or the name that could open doors. I went as Emma Cooper. I wore a modest yellow dress I loved because it made me feel like myself. Not too bright, not too showy. I did my hair in a loose braid. I wore minimal jewelry. My wallet held my ID, my subway card, a single credit card. My father did not know I would go. He trusted me and didn't question my choices. I wanted the evening to be unremarkable. I hoped for conversation, maybe a little teasing, a few stories about Brandon's childhood. I hoped for honesty. If this story is the kind of thing that holds your attention, if you stay with me, I promise it ends with a reckoning. If you like stories about justice, about reputations unraveling, hit subscribe now and stay until the end. The drive to the Hayes estate was quiet. Brandon had insisted on taking his old sedan instead of the car he usually drove for work. I appreciated that small touch of normalcy. He talked about the new project at his company in a distracted way, and I tried to listen. The neighborhood shifted as we approached. Manicured hedges, stone facades trimmed like sculptures, distant laughter spilling from other houses. The valet opened the door for us and took my coat. Indoor chandeliers threw soft stars across the polished floor. It smelled like someone else's money, a perfume that didn't belong on a subway platform, and the faint, unfamiliar tang of a luxury candle. Inside, the room hummed. The Hayes family had invited a crowd that glittered in a different light than mine. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns that seemed immovable. I tried to find the conversation I liked, small, earnest talk, and instead met a chorus of small dismissals. One woman asked where I worked, and when I said graphic design, tilted her head as if that explained everything and nothing. Someone asked what part of the city my apartment was in, and the phrase, "Oh, we don't go that far," fell like a knife. Clarissa Hayes, Brandon's mother, arrived in a way that charged the room. She had a smile that never reached her eyes, and a presence that seemed to recalibrate the temperature. Introductions were short. Her eyes slipped past me like a test I had already failed. There were microaggressions, the little blades dripped slowly. comments on my shoes that were cute but practical, a cousin marveling at my braid as if I had done some quaint theatrical homage. I laughed when it felt right, offered opinions with care. Natasha, Brandon's younger sister, had a voice like a bell and a habit of speaking to the room as a stage. She made jokes about real job, real girl, and a cousin, Jessica, added barbs under her breath, small slights meant to set the tone. I felt them, sure, but I could breathe through them. Part of me cataloged everything. Part of me hoped they were tests I would pass simply by being kind. Then the moment crested. Clarissa, with a tilt of her chin, grew vocal. She asked pointed questions about my upbringing in a tone that made it clear she expected drama. "Which university did you go to?" She asked, not because she cared about education, but because she wanted a category. I answered. It wasn't enough. Someone, I think it was Jessica, called me trash loudly enough that everyone turned. Clarissa laughed. It was the kind of laughter that stacked the room into a verdict. The slap landed like a punctuation mark. One of the guests later told a reporter they thought it would be a joke. Someone else had said the family wanted to teach me a lesson. None of that made sense to me in the moment. My cheek burned. The lights seemed to pulse. Someone's champagne hit my shoe and bloomed across the tile like spilled light. Natasha reached for the seam at my hip and tore. The fabric split, and suddenly my private joke about being modest was no longer mine. It was a prop on someone else's stage. Phones erupted. There were 30 people holding up little glowing rectangles at first, then more. A live stream started that I didn't even know existed. I watched the view count climb like a tiny needle on a gauge, thousands, then tens of thousands. The laughter turned into a background sound, the sort of applause you hear for a spectacle that was never compassionate. I remember thinking in a clear, terrible moment that pain is a strangely honest teacher. I felt humiliation, yes, but beneath the heat of my cheek and the coldness of the room, a quieter thing happened, a sharp, quiet clarity. Looking at Brandon, watching the muscles in his jaw, I realized I would never be the safe, unembarrassed person in his world. I realized he had the capacity to stand between me and harm, but he had chosen not to exercise it. When the slap happened, the instinct was to reach for him, to find refuge in the person I loved. Instead, I found distance. He looked suddenly small, like a person who had been asked to change a line in a script and didn't want to. Not every silence is betrayal, but this one was. It was permission. I left the room, not with drama, not with a scene. I left like someone moving through a fog toward an exit that had always been there. My father, by that point, did not yet know he would step into a room that had just consumed its guest. He was in the city, working late, or so I thought. The helicopter I heard minutes later was a sound that metaphorically and literally cleaved the evening in two. It was a thunder that came from above, a sound that demanded the room look up from its gossip. People's faces turned from their shining screens toward the windows. William Harrison did not storm in to wreak vengeance. He disembarked, calm and precise, with his family secretary Howard trailing behind him. He walked like someone who had always known how to enter a room and gather attention without needing to shout. He took off his coat, the way a man might offer his jacket without theatrics. He offered me his shoulder simply, with no flourish, and wrapped his arm around me as if to say, "You belong to my family, whether or not the world recognizes it." It was protection, yes, but also a kind of reclamation. There were words exchanged. My father asked to see what had happened. Someone handed over a phone. The video, already percolating online, showed everything. The insult, the slap, the tearing of fabric. The room watched itself on that small screen, and suddenly did not like the image that reflected back. If you have ever been in a house where the mirror shows you ugly truths, you know the hush that follows. My father did what he does when a line is crossed. He used leverage, but not to humiliate. He spoke, quietly and with complete control. He asked questions, which carried the weight of consequence. He told the Hayes family that investments tied to their business were being reconsidered, pulled in effect, and that he would be consulting with his lawyers about pursuing charges related to the assault. He did not promise punishment. He promised accountability. That was a distinction I had asked for, in my private mind. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the people who had chosen cruelty to face real consequences for a real choice. The rest was a swift tide. The video recalibrated the narrative. Where the Hayes family had expected to dim me with mockery and the room to smirk, the internet smirked back at them. People who apologized in private found that their words were not enough in public.
Sponsors who had once lined up for Natasha's polished posts began to withdraw after a week of scrutiny. Colleagues in the Hayes circle started taking calls asking about company values. Hayes Real Estate Corp., the family's pride, suddenly found itself under pressure. Investors pulled back, headlines used neutral words like filed for bankruptcy, while comment threads filled with moral calculations. Let me pause here and say this clearly. I am not celebrating a family's hardship. I do not enjoy listing the misfortunes of people who are cruel. But accountability is not malice. When businesses rise on the backs of reputation, and then reputations are shown to be built on tolerance for cruelty, responsibility follows. My father removed financial ties. He did what he could through his means to ensure the family would face the repercussions of the evening's actions. His moves were decisive and legal. Investments withdrawn, legal counsel engaged to file assault charges. That was all anyone could ask. Proportional, measured consequences that aimed to make space for change rather than schedule vengeance. Brandon was fired from his position at Hayes Real Estate. It was a quiet dismissal that nonetheless carried an enormous emotional weight. People who had once applauded his corporate emails now debated his character in public forums. The loss of status was immediate. The loss of connection for me was complicated. He reached out, then did not.
He apologized, in messages, not in person. He said he was sorry and that he was ashamed of his inaction. I read those words with the same calm that had followed the slap: acceptance. Regret does not always repair what it breaks. In the weeks that followed, my life became a patchwork. Interviews that I accepted and others I refused. Messages from people offering support and others from strangers who asked what they would have done. News segments replayed the video, but they also replayed my voice. An interview where I said, "This was not a test of whether I could be humiliated, but whether the people I loved would stand up when it mattered." In one conversation with a journalist, I told them I had wanted to see whether someone's love required public risk. I did not set out to humiliate the Hayes family. I wanted clarity. That should be a simple thing, to know if someone will protect you when you are vulnerable. The internet, predictably, offered its own brand of theater. There were think pieces, a mix of empathy and analysis, and many private messages. Some people blamed me for putting myself in a situation where I could be hurt. I reject that blame. Testing someone's loyalty by being truthful about yourself, in my view, is not entrapment. It is honesty dressed as an experiment. Others sent me notes of gratitude, people who had left toxic situations and wanted to express relief that I had found the clarity they had been too scared to seek. My father handled the fallout with the bluntness of someone used to making hard decisions. He withdrew financial backing from partnerships that were clearly aligned with the family's arrogance. He instructed his legal team to initiate the necessary proceedings related to assault, not because he thirsted for headlines, but because he believed the law should be engaged when a person is harmed. In private, he asked me if I wanted him to be more public, to call names from the podium. I told him no. I had not tested for a spectacle. I had tested for a truth. The rest, I realized, was his business, and his moral responsibility to act as he saw fit. There was a moment, quiet, almost absurd, when I had to sit with the moral complexity of what had happened. The Hayes family suffered reputational and financial damage. People lost jobs, sponsors pulled away, and the corporate entity began the long, messy business process that corporations enter when revenues dry up. For some observers, that was a satisfying arc. For me, it remained bittersweet. I had gained clarity, but someone had been hurt physically. People's livelihoods were affected. The world doesn't balance like a scale with a satisfying ding. Consequences ripple into lives. My father's actions were meant to be proportional and to open space for accountability, not to obliterate lives. 2 weeks after the party, Brandon reached out. His messages were earnest and uneven.
He talked about how he had been shocked by his mother's behavior and how he had been afraid of a family confrontation that would cost him his place. He said he had watched the video and been ashamed. He asked whether we could talk. I met him at a coffee shop, a neutral place where the smell of espresso didn't make me feel like I had to perform for anyone. He sat across from me, fingers tightening on his cup. "What did you want?" he asked, finally. I could have asked him why he didn't move when she hit me. I could have cataloged every missed moment. I chose a different honesty. I told him that I needed to know if someone would choose the hard thing for my sake. I told him that I could forgive a mistake, but not a pattern. He said he wished he'd been different. He wanted to rebuild trust. He offered plans and promises. But trust is not rebuilt with maps and charts. Trust is rebuilt with repeated acts of courage. He had a chance to show me he would do that, and he did not. So I walked away, not with a bang, but with a calm. There was grief, there was anger, there was also an odd relief. I had been trying to confirm something that now sat square and honest in front of me. Some people will act to protect you, and some will look away. That lesson, once learned, allows you to sort your life. It gives you permission to ask for better. After the worst of the news cycle settled, I returned to the small routines that had shaped me before anyone knew my name. I went back to my apartment, to the chipped mug that somehow tasted better after the storm. I went back to work. I continued to design things that mattered to me. My father and I had a conversation in his quiet study one evening after the initial reports had aired. We talked about dignity, about justice, about whether it is our obligation to use power when the powerless are harmed. He said something simple. The choice to act is a measure of who we are. He did not say it was his victory. He said it as a principle. In the aftermath, people I had never met wrote to me about their own experiences. Some spoke of families that made them feel smaller. Others told stories of partners who chose distance when they needed a hand. There was also kindness. Messages from people who said they had found the courage to leave an older relationship or to set firmer boundaries at work. That is what comforted me. Not the headlines, but the tiny, private ways people were reclaiming themselves. Then came the smaller moments of restoration. A charity I had always admired reached out and invited me to speak about public shaming and accountability. I agreed, not to capitalize on pain, but to try to translate it into something useful. I wanted to talk about dignity, how it gets trampled, and how it can be reclaimed. At that event, I met Tyler. He volunteered behind the scenes, quiet and steady, handing out water bottles and listening to speakers afterward, like he was absorbing every detail.
He had a tenderness that was unshowy. He was not dramatic, he was consistent. We spent time together in small increments. He would text a thoughtful line in the morning and show up when he said he would. He asked about my work in ways that were curious rather than performative. He laughed at the jokes I made and noticed the little things that made me feel seen. The way I tucked my hair behind one ear, the precise way I ordered latte foam. He was patient. He did not try to perform care. He simply practiced it. Over months, I realized that what I needed was not grand gestures, but someone who would choose me in the quiet, not the public moments. Over time, the Hayes story became a case study in the media of how social platforms can turn private cruelty into public accountability. Columnists debated who was right and who was wrong. Some people argued that my test had been a trap, that I had provoked humiliation. Others argued that the silence of a partner is itself a form of betrayal. These debates are not what mattered to me. What mattered were the men and women who wrote to say they had left harmful dynamics after seeing the video blow up. What mattered was a tiny girl who told me she learned she could say no when someone ridiculed her for being different. If there is a single lesson I want to leave you with, it is this. So I chose a different path. Years from that night, people still bring it up. They ask if I ever regret the test. I do not. Regret would be to stay in something that does not honor me. I regret, perhaps, that the lesson had to come with such sharp publicness. I lament that someone's cruelty traveled farther than it had any right to. But I treasure the new life I have built in its wake, carefully, intentionally, lined with people who are willing to be embarrassed for my sake because they know what it means to love somebody truly. If you've ever been judged for what you are, your clothes, your background, the size of your bank account, know that you are not defined by those things. You are defined by how you act when someone you love is in need. Character is chosen in the small things and revealed in the big ones. Choose to be the kind of person who shows up. One more thing. I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them in the moment, walked away, revealed your background later? Comment below and tell me the hardest thing you ever had to ask of someone you loved. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that respect is not a luxury, it is a baseline. If you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories about truth, justice, and the messy human work of reclaiming dignity. We live in a world that can measure everything, but will always be learning how to measure what matters. My choice to conceal my wealth that night was meant to find the honest heart in the person I loved. It did. The answer was not what I wanted to hear, but it was the answer that let me build a life worthy of keeping.